So, okay, welcome everyone to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the planning committee for the ICSS Sunday morning. We are based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarx.org, to receive weekly email announcements for our Sunday sessions. We've been doing this for about 15 years now. We used to do them in person, but since the onset of the COVID pandemic, we've been doing them online and generally do a pretty good job on the technical side, but we had a little hiccup here today, and I want to apologize to everybody for the delay. Let me just say that despite the delay, this is going to be a great session. Our speaker today is Carlos Garrido. Carlos is a philosophy instructor at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He's a director of the Midwestern Marx Institute and the author of several books, including The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, and Marxism and the Dialectical Materialist Worldview. His latest book is Why We Need American Marxism, which is what he'll be speaking to us about today. Carlos is also the director of the Midwestern Marx Institute, a very widely followed video blogger and activist, and founding member of the American Communist Party. Carlos has spoken several times at our Sunday morning sessions. In fact, Carlos, we have a very clear gauge of when you first spoke. How old is your son now?
These are difficult questions for us fathers.
Oh, you're gonna get
It's
you're
in
gonna get
October.
you're gonna
It's
get
in
in
October, so
trouble. You're gonna get in trouble. But anyway, the first time he
nearing
spoke,
two.
it was almost from the maternity ward at the hospital.
Yeah.
So we know that we can keep exact time. So what we're going to have today is a presentation by Carlos, followed by a short break for announcements, and then we're going to have questions and answers from session participants. So Carlos, if you want to take it away, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Alan, for inviting me once again. It's always a pleasure to come here and speak, especially to answer questions and to interact, which is usually my favorite section. I want to speak today a little bit about the new book, Why We Need American Marxism. It's a book that in many ways picks up on the book from the previous year, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, which I got to speak here about last year. Um, when I was in Mexico earlier this year, I was presenting on the Purity Fetish book. And in what I do in the Purity Fetish is at the end describe the various forms that this vision of the world, this worldview where people accept something only insofar as it lives up to a pure idea. I devised three different forms that it takes in the US. I say that in the sort of democratic socialist movement, you see it in the people that condemn socialist states because it doesn't live up to the pure idea of socialism in their head. In parts of the communist movement itself, and in some of the more preeminent, it's a difficult word to use for communist organizations in the US, but the more well-known historical organizations in the US, there's a distinctive form that it takes with how a very significant chunk of the working class is viewed, specifically the MAGA base, which are viewed as these unenlightened rabble, this basket of deplorables, completely breaking with the tradition of Marxism-Leninism, which says that even if a part of the working class is backwards, you still go to it and you try to raise their level of class consciousness on the basis of where they're at. That's assuming that that assessment of the MAGA working class is backwards is correct. I tend to disagree. But that's a position that's very prevalent in some groups like CPUSA, PSL, and many other different Lone Ranger communists on the internet. Um, but then there's another one that's relatively new to the US, specifically communist Marxist-Leninist organizations, which is what Georgy Dimitrov called national nihilism. It's the people that, on the basis of the fact that American history is not pure, that it has very ugly aspects to it. It's in some ways premised, of course, on the genocide of the native people of the land. It's premised, of course, on the enslavement of African peoples, and it's in the 20th century. It has the history of imperialism, where tens of millions of people are massacred. Histories of lynching and segregation and apartheid. It's got a very ugly history. And what the national nihilists do is say that this part of America, it defines the whole, it defines the totality, it defines America as a whole. And I think that's a very one-sided way of looking at things. Wherever there is those forms of oppression and exploitation, you're naturally going to have its opposite. You're going to have resistance. And all throughout American history, all of these evil parts of our history are also met with their opposite, which is people waging fierce struggles for freedom, for higher forms of democracy, for anti-imperialist struggles, for labor struggles. And those are in many ways as American, if not more American. Because as a Marxist, which is the position that I'm thinking from, the way that I analyze the world is not through looking at static entities. I tend to think, and we should tend to think as Marxists, that the only way we can understand things is in their process, in the context in which it is they are embedded in. And that's something that's constantly changing. And what we find about America as a social totality is that, yes, it has one pole with a lot of evil stuff, but it also has this other naturally arising, organically arising pole of resistance and struggle. And what has defined what my colleague Noah Krashevik calls the American trajectory, the development of this social totality, what has really defined it has been the progressive pole. I don't think it should be controversial to say that someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who led the Third American Revolution, a political revolution that overthrew apartheid in the US, is more American than the apartheid system that he overthrew, because he represents a higher stage in the development of the social totality that we call America. That was the third form of the purity fetish that I outlined in that book from last year. And I think it's something that, just like the other two, it's very clear how it is based on a wrong analysis of the thing that's being examined. You can't really understand American history, for instance, if all you see is the bad stuff, and on the basis of the bad stuff, because it's impure, you just condemn it completely. That's the nihilism component, that you reduce it to a certain nothingness. But you also cannot connect with your people, because these struggles that we're waging, they take on a national form. I mean, I'm fighting right now out of America, out of the US. I'm not in Timbuktu. I'm not in Vietnam. I'm not in Europe, or I'm in America, and the struggle that I'm waging for the conquest of political power by the working class has a specific context, and that context is meaningful and has always been meaningful to every major Marxist. Georgy Dimitrov used to say that the struggle for socialism is one that is socialist in content, but is always national in form. Jose Carlos Mariátegui, one of the most important Latin American Marxist thinkers, someone who was, very essential for founding the Communist Party in Peru. He used to say that socialism always has to be a heroic creation. You can't just copy and paste something from somewhere else and think that it's going to work. And this is an analysis that Marx himself was making. Like when he starts studying Inca societies, Mayan societies, Indian societies, and is engaging with anthropologist friends like Maxim Kovalevsky, one of the things that he criticizes is how Kovalevsky takes the lexicon that Marx used for Europe and then just exports it very mechanistically onto other parts of the world. And he says, no, you have to study the concrete concretely. You can't just copy and paste things. There's a quote in the manifesto that's very interesting that I think a lot of people have misunderstood because they lack the philosophical basis that Marx is working out of. He says something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing here because, you know, if you're used to my videos, you can see I'm not in my regular setting. He says something along the lines of, although not in substance, but though in form, the class struggle is a national struggle. And then people have this superficial understanding of what it means to be in form, right? To say that the class struggle in form is national. Um, they interpret that to mean that it's not in a meaningful way national, because we have this very superficial understanding that it's really when you pierce through the form and you get at the essence of a thing, when you pierce through the form, when you pierce through the appearance, and you get to the content, that's when you actually understand something. But that's working within the paradigm of like Western philosophy pre-Hegel and Marx. For Hegel and Marx, the in order to understand thing, in order to understand the essence of a thing, in order to understand its content, it's simultaneously to understand how that essence or how that content is it necessarily has to take a very specific appearance. In the case of the essence appearance categorical framework, or in the case of the content form framework, it has to take a very specific form. And this is rooted in our concrete or rooted understanding of how universals work. For us, universals are not these things that are universal precisely because they're fully disconnected from any particular context. On the contrary, what makes universals universals is their ability to take on distinctive forms in accordance with new contexts, with new spatial temporal realities. So when Marx says in the manifesto, along with Engels, that the class struggle is national in form, he's not denigrating the national component. He's saying that no, on the contrary, this universal thing that is the guiding force for the history of hitherto existing society, it always has to take on a specific national form. And that's something that in the last book, The Purity Fetish, I conclude by observing how it is that a large, significant chunk of the left is operating with these very bombastic slogans of like thinking about socialism as abolish America. I mean, there was clubs, CPUSA clubs a couple of years ago that, you know, they're literally tied to an organization called Communist Party of the United States of America. And they were posting pictures of like the American flag as a trash bag, and it was being taken out to the dumpster. I mean, these sorts of images are completely absurd because what they do is take the argument that McCarthy and McCarthyism made against communism, which is telling the American people communism is a foreign ideology, it's anti-American, it's against everything you value. It's taking that argument that heroes of the communist struggle like Paul Robeson fought so fiercely against. It's taking that gun that McCarthy was pointing at us and then just grabbing it and pointing it at yourself. It's literally accepting the dogmas and the lies that McCarthy put out in order for the American people to be alienated from communism. And when, for instance, when Paul Robeson is at HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and he's getting asked about his friend Ben Davis, what does he say? Does he say America's evil? We have to completely condemn it. I have the reference point of my father who was a slave, and you know this whole thing is evil. Get rid of America. No, his answer is like completely the opposite. His answer would get him canceled by the modern left. He says, you know, you guys up there in the stands, you're actually the ones that are anti-American. You guys are the anti-patriots. It's me and it's Ben Davis. We're the real patriots. We're the real people who stand in line with the best of America, with the most progressive traditions. And I think that line is not only more fruitful in gaining support from the American working masses, but it's also the one that we can empirically see that in literally every other country where socialism has succeeded, it's had to take on that national form. It's had to be rooted in the unique traditions and cultures and histories of the people that are waging the struggle for political power. So when the left sits there, the contemporary left, because this is a fairly recent phenomenon, when it sits there and just condemns America and says, no, we're not going to give socialism or the struggle for socialism a national form, what it's saying is that we're the exception. We're the exception. It's a form of American exceptionalism. It says, look, guys, everyone has had to do this around the world. You know, the North Koreans can have Jucha, the Cubans can take up Jose Marti and Antonio Maceo and Felix Valera. The Bolivarians in Venezuela can take up Bolivar, Sucre, all the great, you know, bourgeois revolutionaries. But we're uniquely evil. You know, we're the exception. We have to condemn our national context completely in order to build socialism. And it's frankly it's idiotic. It's a form of American exceptionalism. And this the absurdity of it was made evident to me when I was in Mexico presenting on the book, and I got to speak with about a handful of comrades that came from Cuba, and they were sitting with me, and they were just in awe at the at the you know, the context that I was providing for the status of the American left, specifically on these questions, also on the other ones, but on the question of the utter rejection of American history, the complete forgoing on the task of picking up on our most progressive traditions and building the struggle on that basis. Because, you know, one of these guys worked with the new Fidel Castro Ruz Center in Cuba that developed shortly after El Comandante's death. Another one worked at the Che Guevara Center, very close with the two Aleidas, the daughter and the wife of Che. And these people, they study very closely the works of Fidel, the works of Che, and they see in the works of Fidel and the works of Che an admiration for the American revolutionary tradition. Right after the assault on the Moncada barracks, Fidel Castro gives his famous "History will absolve me" speech, a speech that they didn't allow him to even prepare for. They prevented him from engaging with the books of Jose Marti, and they didn't allow him to even have notes. And he just still showed up and gave an amazing 4-hour speech, as he would go on to do many, many times afterwards. But in this speech, one of the things he cites, invoking his right, his almost basically duty to have this revolutionary struggle, is American revolutionaries. He invokes Jefferson. He invokes the tradition of 1776, the Declaration of Independence. And you know who would as well? Ho Chi Minh. Uncle Ho would invoke in his Declaration of Independence for Vietnam, he would invoke the American Declaration of Independence and also the French, which, you know, modern scholarship, there's scholars like Losurdo who are, you know, very fond of the French Revolution, as he should be, but then turn around and have a similar nihilistic outlook about America, as a good chunk of the American leftists do, without realizing something that Paul Robeson considered to be evident, which is that in many ways the French Revolution ideologically took a whole lot of inspirations from 1776. And, you know, politically, there was the best factions of the 1776 founding fathers, Jeffersonians, Paine, etc., were in full support with the French Revolution. Jefferson, this is something that William Z. Foster writes in his history of the U.S. The first case of Red Scare in America, I wonder if you guys know this, was against Jefferson. Jefferson was called an anarchist, an atheist, and a communist for supporting the French Revolution. So I find it very weird, these mental operations whereby you can support the French revolutionaries, consider it progressive, even if it has contradictions, but then you just wholeheartedly condemn 1776. So I'm sitting here with these Cubans in Mexico, and they just can't wrap their heads around how it is that them in Cuba and their leaders, their ideological leaders, can take inspiration from our great revolutionary tradition, but then Americans have the audacity to just condemn it wholesale. They couldn't wrap their minds around that. And that's when I encountered really the level of absurdity of the American left. My recent trip to Venezuela, I got to speak with you know, communist and progressive socialist delegates from all around the world. And the interactions I had when I spoke about the condition of the left, and specifically this question, was identical to those Cubans. You know, it's really it's a very deformed conception of communism that a lot of these leftists have in the U.S. on the basis of what I've called the purity fetish. You know, just to say something interesting that if it was suggested in the context of the U.S., if it was put on Twitter, would get us absolutely canceled. But it was suggested by Cuban communists to me was the creation of patriot clubs. This is how disconnected the American left is from the global South. That here are these Cuban communists, um, and they're telling me like, have you guys thought about making patriot clubs and then basing your struggle for socialism on an appeal to like patriotic sentiments in the people? Because it's kind of excuse my French, it's kind of fucking common sense. It's how it's been done all over the world. It's how it was done when the Communist Party USA was at its zenith of success. It was literally calling communism 20th century Americanism. And no, that wasn't Browderism. That was Browder when Browder was kind of doing good. That was Browder when Foster was applauding Browder. The Browderism stuff comes well after the conception of Americanism. But you know, so I in this book I pick up the question that okay, we recognize that the struggle for socialism has to take on a national form. But what about Marxism? You know, Marxism itself, this thing that Engels called the proletariat's best working tool and sharpest weapon. Um, does Marxism have to take on a national form, or does Marxism get to have the luxury of just being the same across the board? And as always, I think you know, we're not writing in the context of 1910 of the turn of the 20th century. We're writing in the 2020s. You know, we have a whole lot of class struggles, some which have been fully successful, others which haven't. We have a lot of stuff that we can look back to and analyze scientifically. And one of the things that we find with successful struggles is that the interpretive framework of Marxism is itself also given a national form, is itself also applied to the particular histories and contexts and the forms that the class struggle has taken in the respective countries. For instance, in China, from very early on in their struggles, they realized that they need a Sinified Marxism. Sinified Marxism. It's the same thing in Cuba. In Cuba, their Marxism is very much embedded in the thoughts and the progressive kernels of José Martí, you know, the apostle of the revolution as he's labeled. And it's the same thing everywhere. I was just in Venezuela. You can't disconnect, you know, the unique conception of Bolivarian socialism and the revolutionary ideas that underpin it. You can't disconnect that from Bolivar and his ideals. So Marxism itself, I argue at the beginning of this book, as Maria Dewi mentioned, has to always be a heroic creation. You can't just take the basic insights from Marx, Engels, and Lenin and just rock with those. You have to use that as a worldview, which is the substance of what it is, not just these dead ossified conclusions. It's a worldview. Use that worldview to understand the specific context that you are operating out of. And when we look back and ask ourselves, well, how is it that these countries have done it? Do they just, for Sinified Marxism, do they just go back to all of the Chinese Marxists? You know, for Cubanized Marxism, they don't refer to it like that, but for Cuban Marxism, do they just go back to like all of the Cuban communists before 1959? And the question is no. Like in each instance, it's not just the communists and the Marxist thinkers in the past taken up and consciously used to develop a specific national form of Marxism. It's also the progressive traditions that are incorporated as moments in the trajectory of this class struggle that now takes on the form of being led by a communist party and by conscious Marxist-Leninists. And it's also in the case of China, not just progressive traditions, but the progressive aspects of traditions that are so central and rooted in the identity of the people. So, for instance, Confucianism. You know, Confucianism has components of it that are quite reactionary, patriarchal, etc. but Confucianism has a whole lot of rational kernels. And in the construction of Sinified Marxism, they're not just pulling from progressive traditions, the Taipei Rebellion, etc. They're also pulling from basic paradigms of thought that have been central to Chinese identity, like Confucianism, and taking rational kernels from that. What in Confucianism is able to help us develop our analysis, our Marxist analysis in our specific context, and fight for the construction of socialism. So for us in America, I think we have to do the same. Like, we need an American Marxism, or American Marxism-Leninism, whatever you want to call it. And that means not just going back to some of the most pivotal Marxist thinkers of our past, people who have been consciously and explicitly Marxist, but it also means going back to other progressive traditions. And it also means going back to figures that are at times quite contradictory, that have some aspects that are very progressive and other aspects that are quite reactionary. And so in this book, I start the story of these struggles and forms of thought that are, I think, at the foundation of the construction of American Marxism. I started off with, for instance, the indigenous communities, who, for the Iroquois, for instance, Henry Louis Morgan, the famous American anthropologist, the person who has studied on the state and these indigenous communities, was basically the basis, not just for Marx's ethnological notebooks, but for Engels's The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, a very well-respected thinker by both Marx and Engels. Do you guys know what he called the Iroquois, the native communities in the US? He called them communism in living, communism in living. And historiography on the subject has shown that some of the first settlers on these lands from Europe looked at those experiments and learned a lot from them, and in some ways took up various aspects of this communism and living, and tried to incorporate it in their forms of governance in many ways. And there's studies that have been done about this in other areas, not just in the US. In many ways, some of the designs of political constitutions and state structures that are taking up for the modern bourgeois form of life, a lot of them are looking at the indigenous communities that they interact with, and taking lessons from that. So I think any history of progressive America has to have those indigenous struggles within it. Then I look at a figure like Roger Williams. Roger Williams was one of the first settlers in the US, very devoted Christian. And as soon as he started hearing racist ideas about the indigenous or Africans, and supremacist ideas about European whites and what they were constructing here in what would later be called the US, he was completely against that. He was emphasizing the fact that we're all equal in God's eyes. Very much a strong critic of American exceptionalism, of racism, and a real, genuine, consistent proponent of Christianity, which I think, it's a whole separate topic, but I think that oh, I think that there's more than a few rational kernels there. It's not without reason that the work that Engels focuses on in the end of his life, which is taken up then by Karl Kautsky, is the homologies between early Christian communities and the early socialist movement. But we have the indigenous, we have Roger Williams. Then we look at 1776, and it might be hard, for those of us that are conscious of how completely reactionary American imperialism has been, how it's been the main force that squashes or prevents emancipatory revolutions from around the world, specifically in the 20th century and after the Second World War. It might be hard for us to realize that 1776 was an extremely revolutionary rupture with the old world. It was the first Declaration of Independence that's based on the idea that all human beings are equal, you know, that are endowed with certain rights to life, liberty. And here they completely move away from Locke. Instead of property, they say pursuit of happiness. And you know what else they say in that Declaration of Independence? That when people are being oppressed, they have not only the right, but the duty, right? The duty to overthrow their government, you know, basically legitimizing what can later be labeled uh, um, wars of national liberation. Um, so, you know, progressive historians, communist historians like Herbert Aptheker, progressive historians like Stoughton Lind, have all realized that this was like the first anti-colonial revolution in the hemisphere, that it was very inspirational, not just for the French, but for the Haitian and for anti-colonial struggles from all over the world, and that it was based on quite radical ideas for its time. You know, people, professors in Europe could get suspended, um, could get even jailed for teaching the Declaration of Independence in some of the most reactionary, feudal, aristocratic parts of Europe. So there's definitely a progressive kernel there in the ideas of the uh, what's called the dissenters within the founding fathers, people like Jefferson, people like Paine, uh, and there's no reason why someone like Jefferson or even Paine can't play for us a similar role as Bolivar plays for the Venezuelans. In fact, it's the Venezuelans themselves who told me, "Why don't you guys do this?" And I said, "Look, at one point when the Communist Party was actually successful up and running, there was stuff called the Jefferson School where Du Bois taught. They were doing this, I think, correctly." Um, One of the things that literally basically no one knows about in the world communist movement, and unfortunately in America where we should know about it, we don't know either, is that in the 1820s and 30s, there's the flowering of a homegrown tradition of American socialism that is based not on foreign ideas as some of the utopian communities were, with ideas coming from Saint Simon, from Robert Owens, from Charles Fourier, you know, French revolutionary tradition, and with Owens English. Um, these ideas were developed on the basis of the democratic creed of the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson's writings. And in this period of the 1820s and 30s, you have people like Cornelius Blatchley, Langdon Bilsby, Thomas Skidmore, William McClure, some of which, for instance, McClure was involved in with Owens in the construction of New Harmony, which is New Harmony, by the way, because there was a Harmony before that. It's you know, the same area that's taken up, and then they do New Harmony. Um, but you know, these people in the 1820s, so like 20 to 30 years before well, 2 decades before the main writings of Marx and Engels that make them Marxist, like the writings where they're developing the foundations of Marxism proper, which I think you could probably pinpoint 1845, 46 with the writing of the manuscripts that form the German ideology. But 20 years before that, you have these people that are looking at the utopian experiments and they're like, you know, there's something about that that's not right. It's premised on the idea that you can escape the existing order, appeal to the goodwill sentiments of wealthy people to throw money at projects that promote these ideals of justice. And these guys, a lot of them, they held that in many ways the acceptance of those ideals by the rich owners was very disingenuous, because what we find in the world itself is that none of those ideals, those democratic ideals, are fully realized. Yes, it's a step forward from feudal absolutism, but we have our own forms of absolutism that arise with this new form of life. And what all of these thinkers end up almost like simultaneously deciding and taking up as individuals is a project that attempted to study the existing order as scientifically as possible, for the sake of understanding how within that order itself there was the potential for constructing a new social order that some of them called communalism. But it's basically what they were operating with was a conception that socialism is not something that's built as an alternative, running away from what exists, but socialism is something that is already embedded in an embryo, implicit within the current form of life. There's a class that produces, which is the one that embodies in its very being the potential for building a new form of life in its own image, building a socialist society. In essence, what these guys were developing in the 1820s was scientific socialism. It wasn't as concrete and as well formulated and explicit as Marx and Engels would, of course, develop it into. But it's thinkers in the 1820s, 20 years before Marx, in the U.S., using Jeffersonian ideas to try to develop a socialism on a scientific basis. And no one knows who the hell these people are. I've been able to encounter with them because I've been able to read books from the 1940s and 50s where there was some scholarship done on them. And then I've scoured libraries and the internet to look for information on them. And there's very, very little. And these are people that we should hold up as heroes because they're basically Marxist, pre-Marx proto-scientific socialist. Along with this tradition, you had, of course, the two main tendencies in American philosophy, pragmatism and transcendentalism. If you look at transcendentalism, there was a historian who wasn't a communist, but was a progressive historian at the middle of the 20th century. And one of the things that he said, and I cite it in the book, the name is slipping me right now, but one of the things that he said is that Emerson is a forefather of American communism, right? So America's first philosopher within a new American tendency, transcendentalism. Here's a very prominent historian saying that he's a forefather of American communism. Then you look at people like Henry David Thoreau, right? Which today the libertarians take up as their own, but at the time he was writing for the same newspaper that Marx was, the New York Daily Tribune. And there's an exercise that Stoughton Lynn does in his Origins of American Radicalism, a book, which I've done it in my classes and I do it in this new book, which he gets passages from Thoreau and passages from Marx, and he puts them next to each other and makes you guess which one is which. And guys, it's very hard to tell because you get those passages from the early Marx on alienation, on the sort of loss of selfhood that happens in when objectification takes the form of alienation with capitalist relations of production. And then you go look at Thoreau, and there's passages that are almost identical, that are speaking to this crisis, this fundamental disconnection between ourselves and our labor and what it means to be human and nature and the product of our labor. And, it's kind of shocking. I know that there's people, and I've done this in some of my classes in the past, that do the same thing with Adam Smith, get quotes from Smith and quotes from Marx and ask people to guess which one is which. And it is kind of hard. So you have one tradition of American transcendentalism that's extremely progressive in character and has a lot of overlaps with Marxism and in some ways collaborated with Marx because they wrote for the same paper. Then you have this other tradition called American pragmatism. And one of the things that I show is that its founder, Charles Sanders Peirce, who would later on end up saying that what he was a pragmaticist because he wasn't too happy with William James's development of pragmatism. But Charles Sanders Peirce, if you look at his essay on evolutionary love, what he basically puts forward is a utopian Christian socialist conception of society, of history, of epistemology, so how it is that we come to know the world, and of logic. It's a very interesting essay, and it's one that's in line with the rest of his work. And I cite some of the leading Peirce scholars who have done work in this area. It's basically a socialist logic, a utopian socialist Christian um, conception of history, logic, epistemology that's based on the Christian notion of agape, sort of this communal love. So again, founder of pragmatism, very anti-capitalist in terms of orientation. William James was another one. William James called himself a sort of anarchist, which I know is no good, but at the time that he's working at, the turn of the 20th century, the anarchists were a little better. They were a little closer to us Marxists in the U.S. specifically at that point. You had groups like the IWW, and William James was supportive of these efforts. He was one of the founders of the Anti-Imperialist League and was fiercely critical of capitalism. Then you have someone like John Dewey, who I work at my university at the Center for Dewey Studies, where Dewey's old manuscripts are all at, like physically. It's a very great place to work at. But the figure of John Dewey is interesting. He's called America's philosopher of democracy. So like at the level of philosophy, the most American democratic philosopher. And what was Dewey? Dewey was a socialist, admittedly so. Yes, he was operating with a distorted Red Scare understanding of the Soviet Union and had some anti-communist sentiments, and we should criticize those. But America's philosopher of democracy, and then proclaims himself to have been a democratic socialist on the basis of what he called the reconstitution, the reconstruction of radical liberalism. He was someone who was not just a thinker, was involved in a lot of very radical unionizing efforts, um, and two projects that had as their sole purpose the bringing together of the radical forces that opposed the two big business parties, which are still the two big business parties that we have today, the Democrats and the Republicans. So someone that actively militated for a socialist radical third party to take root in America. He was a supporter of Norman Thomas, which is like the Debs after Debs, almost like a negative sublation, because instead of becoming better and elevating Debs to a higher stage, it's kind of a retrogression. But it's obviously not a Marxist-Leninist thinker. But again, do the Chinese just pull from their Marxist-Leninist thinkers? No. But this is someone called America's philosopher of democracy and a socialist. Why wouldn't we be talking about that in the construction of an American Marxism? How are you, ruling class, going to tell me that communism and Marxism are foreign to America when some of the most prominent thinkers in our country were socialist and had quite a few affinities in their philosophy with Marxism itself? Then you look at a figure like MLK, who is perhaps more central in defining the modern American identity than MLK. And MLK was a socialist. I'm sure that the vast majority of people here know he was a socialist. So I think this exercise is important. It's important to show that a lot of the great intellectuals, a lot of the great minds, some of the most formative people in American history were very anti-capitalist in their thinking, and some explicitly socialist, some explicitly Marxist and Marxist-Leninist. In terms of struggles, I would like to go back a little bit to the 1860s, but to an 1860s that's mediated by 1935, which is where I argue American Marxism is officially born as American Marxism, as the taking up of the general insights of the Marxist theory of class struggle and applied to that to our specific context. And this is done, I think, in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and his Black Reconstruction. It's a work that for us American communists should be up there with the greats of modern thought, like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Hegel's Science of Logic, and Marx's Capital. I think it seriously is a book that's that important for us, because it gives us, and it systematizes in a very scientific form the centrality that the struggle against the color line, the Black freedom movement, has played as the determinate form class struggle has taken in the U.S. So his argument, following the work of Marx and Engels, who held that the most pivotal thing for class struggles in the 19th century was the emancipation of the enslaved proletariat in the U.S. South, alongside the emancipation of the Russian peasants. Du Bois develops upon this very creatively. He starts his book, the first chapter. I'm sure some of you know, the chapter's title is Black Proletariat. This is very meaningful. This is very meaningful because just 2 decades prior, or no, 1 decade prior, you had the publication of Morris Hillquit's History of Socialism in the United States. Morris Hillquit, one of the great intellectual minds of the Socialist Party, he writes his 500-page book, and there's no mention of the Civil War, only in a very tangential form when talking about the First International. In the 19th century, you had labor radicals like Orestes Bronson and quite a few 48ers and northern labor radicals who held that what we had to worry about was wage slavery. Chattel slavery is a completely different thing. We have to deal with the question of wage slavery first, and then that chattel slavery stuff will come after. When Du Bois develops the notion of the black proletariat, what he does is make it evident that there is no distinction of interest between the northern white working class, the southern poor white working class, and the enslaved proletariat. They're each workers that take on a distinctive different form, but they're each workers and have a fundamental interest. And if we understand, as Marx and Engels did, and this is evident in their writings on the Irish question, that racism, and this is that basically direct quote from Marx, is the secret through which the capitalist ruling class sustains its power. Fighting against that racism that split our working class, our people apart, how are we not going to consider that a class struggle? Why would we operate with this white blind spot, as some historians refer to it, where we only see class struggle when it's white workers in a factory fighting against their bosses? No. What Marxism helps us understand is that class struggle takes many forms. Engels held that the struggle against patriarchy was the first form of class struggle. Marx and Engels saw not only these struggles against slavery, but national struggles for national liberations as forms of class struggle. With Marxism-Leninism, it becomes explicit that in many ways, national liberation struggles and anti-imperialist struggles are like the front line of the class struggles for the age, for the stage of imperialism, capitalist imperialism. So these struggles that the black proletariat was waging for freedom, they were class struggles. And they literally won the war, which is, the information was there for the historians to provide, but they didn't, because, we have this saying that only the victors write history. The Civil War is the one of the only cases that I've been able to find to the contrary. The leading historians in Columbia, Harvard, that were crafting the narrative about the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction, they all had affinities with the South. They all had heart aligned themselves with the South, and so they had no vested interest in telling the truth. And it's not until Du Bois in 1935 where we get, I think, the real story of the Civil War, which is that it was very much leaning towards the South. By the way, his analysis, it's Marxist through and through. He shows how you have this clash of forms of production, where in the South you had the cotton kingdom that was trying to become a cotton empire, expanding westward and south. The North that contradicted. There was a contradiction there with capitalists of the North and the Southern planter class, and that creates the context for the Civil War. For quite a bit of the Civil War, it looked like the South was going to win, and then there's a turn. And as someone who's been educated in American schools, they're never clear about what the hell that turn is. It's always like somehow General Lee's this badass general, and then out of nowhere the South just starts losing. And Du Bois is the one that gives us the answer for why that happens. you have what he calls a general strike. The black proletarians in the US South literally flee to the North. And what ends up happening is a double whammy. The South gets its productive base for its war economy completely gutted, and then the North ends up getting this renewed body of workers, of soldiers, and very, soldiers that are actually fighting and wanting to fight, not just people that are conscripted, like people that wanted to wage that war, and then capable spies that knew the terrain of the U.S. South. So it's because of this general strike, Du Bois hold, that the tide turns. The North is able to win the war, and then what happens after that? He
Carlos, what I'd
held,
like to do is maybe stop at this point. We're going to take a short break. We want to give people a chance to ask questions and make comments. We got started kind of late, so
yeah,
maybe we should divide the time a little more equally. Does that sound okay for you?
yeah, yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. So what I want to do is, for those of you who have questions and comments for Carlos, you can go down to the reactions button on the lower part of your screen and raise your hand. I'm going to try to get everybody in. Uh, well, I can see
Can I
already.
just can I finish
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
Du Bois
Go
point
ahead.
real quick?
Sure.
Because I think it's important. He lets us know that after that period of Reconstruction, what you have is the Freedmen's Bureau that are basically governing over a whole lot of the states in the US South. And he calls that a dictatorship of the proletariat. You have an organized body of emancipated workers dictating their will on society and backed up by the forces of the Northern Army. And so his argument is that there was a dictatorship of the proletariat in the US South. And guys, we celebrate every single year the Paris Commune. God bless the French. They had their 3-month commune in the 1870s, but we had a dictatorship here in the US South, a dictatorship of the working class that started before the Paris Commune and that lasted almost 10 years. So a hell of a lot longer. And no one ever talks about it because we haven't read Du Bois and haven't been able to recognize him as our institute does as the father of American Marxism. So just to wrap up real quick, I think it's important to give Marxism a national form, to embed ourselves in these histories that I have been talking about, to take up the figure of Du Bois as the person that gives us the insight of the centrality of the struggle against the color line, to see the third American Revolution, the civil rights movement, as the sort of completion of that struggle that gets overthrown in 1876 with the counter-revolution of property. And that's how I think we can begin to make sense of where it is that we are today in terms of the class struggle.
Okay. Thank you. Boy, I'll tell you, the raised hands are lighting up our participants board. This is probably the most number of people at the end of a presentation that I can remember we've had. Before we go on, I just want to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, we have some excellent sessions coming up on uh, Sunday. Next week. We're going to have Radhika Desai will be speaking on the long shadow of Hiroshima, capitalism and nuclear weapons. She, you guys, she's spoken at Sunday mornings in the past. She's a internationally known, world-renowned Marxist intellectual. We'll be talking about nuclear war, which is something that historically and the current threat, which I think is a very important topic, as we all know, the dangers are really rising. The following Sunday on the 25th, we're going to have Roger Harris speaking on the elections in Venezuela that just took place. Roger was in Venezuela, I believe with you, Carlos. I think you were there too, and has just published an article which I would ask him to drop into the chat so that people can read it. We'll post it up on our announcement when we get it set. But a lot of controversy, a lot of struggle, a media battle over this question of the validity of the elections and what's going on in Venezuela. Roger will be giving us a firsthand witness testimony about what he saw and an analysis of what happened in the elections. So those are our next two sessions that are coming up. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get to the list of people who have their hands raised. My goodness, we have 8. I want to ask everybody to please limit your questions to limit them to at most a minute or two, one question at a time. You can come back if we have time later for a second round. And also for Carlos, if you could try so we can get everybody in. I mean, if we took everybody 5 minutes for everybody, we're going to run out of time. So try to maybe focus on the answers and we'll do what we can here. So, and please, everybody, be patient with me. I'm going to try to get everybody in. I'm going to call people in the order that I can do, and let's get going on that. So, well, one last thing, if you want to sign up for future references for our programs, go to our website at icssmarks.org, icssmarks.org, and there's a sign up form. If you sign up, you'll get an email notification every week for our programs, which will include a link that will hopefully work for future sessions. You can also check our past session videos, and you can also contact us if you wish to contact us through the contact form on the web page. So I'm going to start off with Sharon Rose. If you would hold on a second, let's just change this. If you would unmute yourself and ask your question, Sharon, followed by Michael Hoey. So go right ahead.
Thank you. So, Carlos, thank you for uplifting Du Bois's work. I think it's one of the best, certainly not the only, and you gave us a lot of other philosophers and writers to think about. I have studied the history of the Communist Party USA fairly well, and including its current program. And I think that you're wrong about that organization. I don't see how, this is my question, how can you call that party's position nihilist when and anti-American or something like that, when they're part of their whole program and their line is that we want to build Bill of Rights socialism. And of course, what you say is true, that the struggle for socialism has to take a national form. But what I see online and what people have shown me online, because I'm not that great at looking at Discord, but other people have shown me a lot of the memes that are out there for this group calling itself the American Communist Party are really, I think, racist, bordering on racism. And I can't even say the words. It's hard for me to even say the words MAGA communists, which is what they uphold. And I don't think that my saying that and being kind of nauseated by the idea means that I reject white working people, or I don't think white working people are part of the American working class. Of course they are. We all are. There's one class. And finally, as our well, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. I'll say that I don't think there is national Marxisms. I think there's one Marxism. There's socialism with national characteristics and temporal characteristics. What the Bolsheviks built in the first part of the 20th century, they did on the basis of where the forces of production were then, and now in the 21st century, the forces of production are at a completely different level. But
Sharon, I think that's a 2.5. So
let's
give them a chance.
Thank you.
Okay. So Carlos, we take one question at a time.
Yeah. To address am I muted?
No, you're fine.
To address the first part of your comment, I said that parts of CPUSA. CPUSA is was a heterogeneous organization with different components in it, and there were many clubs that definitely treaded in this national nihilism. The ruling Sims clique is a little bit better on the question of America itself. That I have not rejected. In fact, when we were combating and within this organization, some of the national nihilists and the ultra leftists, one of the things that was often invoked was the article that Joe Sims long ago did on patriotic socialism, on the definite existence of a working class rooted progressive patriotic socialism, which is still, I think, a fairly good article, irrespective of the fact that Joe Sims has completely violated procedural democracy and democratic centralism to enforce a line that is definitely fascistic and that completely endorses a party that sends $100 billion of American taxpayer money to literal Nazis in Ukraine to fight their proxy war against Russia, and that sends many, many billions of dollars to the Zionist supremacist entity, very akin to the Nazis in quite a few ways, that's currently
That's
carrying
ridiculous.
forth the
That's just not
genocide.
true. That's a lie.
Okay,
The
what I want
Communist
to
Party
try to
supports the Democrats.
what I
The
want to try
Communist
to
Party
do is
USA supports the Democrats. That's
we're gonna
indubitable.
we're gonna invite either you, Carlos, or somebody back from the ACP, the American Communist Party, and let's have like a focused discussion on this question of it. I think for the future, that would be my proposal. Okay, let's move on. Let's get Michael Hoey, if you would unmute yourself and ask your
Yes.
question. Then I'm going to get Freddie on here, and then Sheila, you have your hand up. Do you want to participate, but you haven't been able to click the reactions button? We'll get you on. Okay, so go ahead, Michael,
So
please.
my question has to do with an organization referred to as the Caribbean Legion, started in 1946, and both Che and Fidel were part of it. They were trying to overthrow Trujillo in Dominican Republic, and also had their sights set on Somoza in Nicaragua and the guy in Costa Rica, and they were successful overthrowing the man in Costa Rica. But I don't know much about this. I'm wondering if there's videos on it, if there's books on it, and how what was done in the late 40s led into what went on through the 50s and then the US response to the Cuban Revolution.
That's a great question. I haven't studied that Caribbean League very much, but Che Guevara and Fidel definitely learned from the struggles against Trujillo, from the struggles against Somoza, a lot from the government of Arbenz and the overthrow of that government in 53, 54. So that's all I can say with regard to that topic. Alan, would I be able to say something real quick as far as the last question? Because there's
Right ahead,
some
you're the
quite
speaker. Let's
right.
try to
Yeah,
keep it on your book. Go ahead.
there's a lot of preposterous things that were suggested there. One of them including racism, which is I can't even imagine where it is that that's coming from, specifically for an organization that upholds Du Bois as like the fourth head of Marxism, and that explicitly says that the most important form the class struggle has taken in the US has been the struggle against racism. So it's so preposterous that it literally turns the world on its head. As far as MAGA communism, I think you are operating with a misconception of what it is. I think the information that has been fed to you is probably very incorrect. It's an information that has been fed to a whole lot of people and has led to many misconceptions. MAGA communism is not an ideology. It was a meme. It was a joke of sorts that was used in order to brand communism in a way that's appealing to MAGA people. Not so that you can get communists to vote for Trump. It was always anti-Trump. The whole purpose of it was to reach the MAGA working class base and convince them about communism. And that, I'm sorry to say, even though at the time we never endorsed it, and to this point, as an institute, we have never endorsed it, but it still was extremely effective. The biggest voices in the American communist movement, people like Jackson Hinkle, people like Haas, who are the other components that came together to form ACP, reaching millions and millions and millions of people. Without Jackson Hinkle right now, for instance, in Venezuela, there would have been no one that combated on Twitter the lies of the fascists and the far right that were boosted by Elon Musk. They literally sent in the CIA to hire Colombian goons to kidnap him in his hotel, and the Venezuelan government had to protect him and then gave him an interview with Maduro. So the MAGA communism thing was the meme that allowed them to begin to grow, and it worked. And we have to understand that we're in a digital age where things like memes and the struggle for ideas within social media have an intense importance in the war of position, in the battle of ideas. And I'm sorry, but a whole lot of the people that are in these spaces just do not know, do not understand how social media works, what sort of posts get visibility, and what visibility allows you to do. It's not just online, it's real people that are engaging with it, hundreds of thousands that have been convinced. And now it's literally the basis for a new organization, even though the organization has nothing to do with MAGA communism. It's the following that has been garnered, the people that have engaged with our work that are now literal militants in a party that's frankly actually communist, unlike others that bear that name.
So Carlos,
just,
let me, yeah, go ahead.
As far as the ACP, the vast majority of the ACP were the people that got purged by the Communist Party, hundreds of militants and dozens of clubs. Those people are the ones that formed the foundation of the ACP. It's the people who had their democratic constitutional rights in the Communist Party stripped at the 32nd National Convention that are the basis of the ACP. And then the Party of Communists, which had long ago split from the Communist Party for reasons very similar. 80% of that party completely quits and then comes to join the ACP. The ACP is a party of unity, and our main things are anti-imperialism and advancing the class struggle.
I think we're going to have a future program on this topic where we can focus on it. Let's go to Freddie, if you would unmute yourself, followed by Sheila. So Freddie, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the devil is in the details here. I don't think anyone here would disagree with looking at Du Bois as a hero, looking at slave revolts as something that we should look up to, or John Brown. There's a lot of figures that are, that were very progressive, whether they were communists or not. And then there are other figures that were not, who were representing their class interests, those being the so-called founding fathers. I mean, if a person has a Marxist analysis, that's what they were. They were people representing their own class interests. They didn't, and this is not just about words, they didn't consider Black people or Native people as human beings. We could point out an individual here or there who felt differently, but the project as a whole is what it was. It was settler colonialism, it was genocide, etc. And then, the discussion about Hinkle will be a longer one, and hopefully there will be another forum on this, because we can't just say, oh, well, this was just a meme that we found useful. This is a very dangerous meme, okay? With a lot of dog whistles loaded in there. And to really not look at the complexity of that, and to just sort of tail, well, a lot of people maybe are into this, that's not a reason for supporting something. That was a brand, and again, it's weird, like, was it serious? Was it not serious? It's serious to use a slogan that literally was copyrighted by Donald Trump and to try to use it as somehow the inverse of what it is. I think that's just a dangerous way to play politics. It's an opportunistic way to play politics. And I think in the end, it's not going to look good for your group that you've aligned yourself with someone like Jackson Hinkle. And people can do their own research, but you could see links of the guy basically admitting that he's all about the clout. So,
okay, so that's two minutes. I'm not trying to cut people off, but believe me, I would love to. I wish we had 2 more hours to talk about this specific subject, but I'm going to give Carlos a chance to respond, and then I'm going to ask Sheila to ask her question. So Carlos, please go ahead.
You mentioned that the founders were bourgeois acting on their own class interests. I agree, but context is important. Nothing exists divorced from space and time. And as Marx makes evident, it is only in the early to middle of the 19th century that it becomes explicit that the bourgeoisie becomes a reactionary / conservative class. The bourgeoisie was a revolutionary class in the context of the struggle against feudalism, and that's the context that produced the founding fathers. A lot of them that were students and proponents of the Enlightenment, which is founded on a universal conception of humanity, on a belief in universal reason, and on a belief in progress. A whole lot of them, yes, there was a compromise in order to keep slavery with the southern states, but a whole lot of the ones that I'm pulling from, the dissenters and the most progressive ones, they held that within a generation, slavery will be abolished. And there's more than a few quotes from Jefferson condemning slavery. And yes, it's a contradiction because he had his own slaves. And there's quotes where he says, "I hope there's no God because I will burn in hell for what I've done." And those are objective contradictions, and we're not scared of those. But those progressive bourgeois revolutionaries, just like Bolivar was imperfect and Father Hidalgo was imperfect, but yet those struggles in those countries took those up. We have to do the same with the progressive kernels of the founding fathers. Yes, there was settler colonialism as a form that the capitalist mode of production took in the US, and that has completely been outmoded, specifically after the closing of the frontier in 1890. There's lingering aspects of it, but the primary form that capitalism takes in the US is in the stage of imperialism. It has nothing to do, the contradiction is not one between settlers and non-settlers or settlers and former slaves. The contradiction that exists in the US, the principal one, is between working people and the parasitic owning class that keeps us all desperate and poor and indebted. As to the second component of your question, I mean, it's very similar to the previous one. MAGA communism had nothing to do with tailing MAGA. It had nothing to do with voting for Trump. It was a slogan of sorts that helped to rally MAGA people to leave Trump and go towards communism. And there's a whole lot of them that did. It's a slogan that's extremely successful. I live in the Midwest. I talk to my coworkers and people in my community, a lot of them who voted for Trump, not because of the more bigoted things Trump says. They voted in spite of that. They voted for Trump because when they hear "Make America Great Again," what they think is about an America where one job was enough, where you had security, an America before the onslaught of neoliberalism and the general impoverishment and austerity that has meant for the people. An America that was, you know, kind of the closest to actually upholding somewhat people's welfare, because we had a strong Communist Party that was able, and a strong labor movement that was able to win over concessions. That's what comes to mind for a whole lot of working people when they hear MAGA, and there's definitely a rational kernel there that should be stripped away from Trump and added to communism. And if you want to do it with the liberals as well, go right ahead. But what I have noticed in my personal experience in the Midwest is that regular working class people that voted for Trump are a hell of a lot closer to where we are as communists than any of the middle class liberals that are going out there and voting for Kamala or for Biden. And it's very clear, because look at how they view the ruling institutions, whether repressive or ideological in character. They're distrustful of the media. They're distrustful of the military-industrial complex. They're distrustful of big pharma, big agriculture, Bill Gates. They're distrustful of virtually every ruling institution in society. They see Trump as the guy that's going to drain the swamp. Of course, that's a false prophet. It's a form of false consciousness that's operative there. But we have to be there and say, hey, these rational kernels, these insights that are quite radical that lead you to Trump, he's not the answer. Communism is the answer. And we've been effective in doing that. And it's not without reason that Jackson Hinkle has, you know, almost 3 million people that follow his work. And I was just in Venezuela with him. Why does the third world and the global South love Hinkle? But it's only white and usually middle-class leftists from the U.S. that dislike him for stuff that he posted. There was white leftists from the U.S. criticizing the meme picture that he put where he was standing, he cropped himself, photoshopped himself in, standing next to President Maduro. But you know who liked that picture? Yvonne Hill, the foreign ambassador to the U.S., who went up to Jackson right in front of me and told him that he was a huge fan and that he loved the picture, that he laughed super hard, and that he showed his colleagues at the higher levels of the Venezuelan government. So, I mean, you guys need to realize that this hatred that a lot of the American left has for Jackson Hinkle, it's very exclusive to the American left. The Houthis love Jackson Hinkle. That's why they brought him in to speak to the leaders of the Ansar Allah movement. The Russians love Jackson. The Chinese love Jackson. When we launched the party, it went viral on Chinese social media, Bilibili. Jackson is the most viral American in all of Chinese social media. So, like, really reflect why it is that it's primarily American, very liberal-minded Americans who might call themselves communists who hate Jackson, but why do the progressives and socialists and communists all across the global South like him very much? And I was able to confirm that in person in my time in Venezuela.
Okay, let's go with Sheila. If you would unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. It's quite impressive, and your scope is quite amazing. One thing to consider about criticizing Jefferson and for his treatment of African Americans, Africans, and indigenous people is that a lot of the hatred for these figures, the absolute hatred for them, comes from the Black left and from the indigenous left in the United States. And I think to abandon that hatred for these despicable people is in a way abandoning, in some respect, or disrespecting the feelings of those aspects, those parts of the left that should not be left out, because they are in fact in the vanguard of the left in the United States, if they're allowed to be. So you might consider that in your pursuit of nationalism, that, you know, there are people who consider Africans colonized people within the United States, and that they are deserving of their own form of nationalism, which will totally reject people like Jefferson, or, you know, like we learned from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz that white leftists who may uphold Bacon's rebellion are ignoring the fact that the unity of the Black and white, before they were known as white, workers in the colonies was directed at hacking indigenous people and stealing their land. Okay, so we have to acknowledge that. The respect for Black nationalism, for indigenous nationalism, and also, you know, if I may, you know, the Communist Party used to be 40% African American. I don't know, I haven't really studied why that declined, but in your group, what percentage of your organization is African American, Latino, and Asian American? Because I will say that in pursuit of the use of nationalism to promote a national or even international, even the internationals, often people of color get thrown under the bus, as happened to Japanese Americans during World War II.
Okay, Carlos, go ahead.
Thank you for your question. And I would like to reiterate that I'm not talking about nationalism. I consider nationalism to be fundamentally, in an imperialist context, to be class collaborationist. I'm talking about socialism taking a national form, which is completely different from nationalism. As far as the situation you described with Black nationalism and indigenous nationalism, I'm going to be frank. This is a very, specifically in the Black community, an extremely small group of people that do not speak for the vast majority of Americans. It's an age-long debate. Of course, you had the Garveyites that would debate with Du Bois, and Du Bois that would debate with Booker T. Washington. And the Black community in America is not a homogeneous entity, but I would say that with confidence, and there's statistical evidence for this, more than 90% of Black people just consider themselves American. They have no interest in pursuing, you know, a nation of their own, either in the Black Belt or elsewhere. And I think that in many ways, you know, what America is fundamentally, America is almost like a black country. And I know that's a bold thing to say, but the way that I think about nations is as rooted in the class struggles that define what that nation is. And if the forefront of the class struggle has been the Black freedom movement, we can't divorce America from the contributions of Black people. We can't divorce Black people from what America is. I think in many ways, the anti-American sentiment is anti-Black, because America is nothing if it's not nothing culturally, it's nothing in the realm of ideas, it's nothing in the realm of material class struggles if it's not rooted in that Black freedom movement. So I wholeheartedly reject, you know, the thesis that Black Americans are completely something else. I think it's something that is foreign to the vast majority of the Black community. I would say something similar for Indigenous communities, although a better case for, you know, Indigenous sovereignty could, I agree, be made there. And look, a communist party, if there's Indigenous communities that want sovereignty, that would you know, absolutely get it. There's obviously going to have to be some form of land reform, respect of, you know, treaties that were broken. All that stuff is a given for us. But I find that it's usually middle class, college educated white folks that are promoting things like land back, things like the New Africans ideology, which says that Black people are something completely different. As an immigrant myself, historically, it's been usually right-wing racists that have tried to tell people who are not white Anglo-Saxons that they're not American. So I find it almost like a horseshoe theory when people take it up and try to give a progressive veneer on what is fundamentally tribalistic and promotes disunity at a time when the American people are more united than ever. I mean, like, guys, you know, I know BLM was co-opted by the Democrats, but there was still 25 to 35 million Americans that hit the streets. A whole lot of them were Black. It was, I mean, white. It wasn't just Black people that were in the streets. It was a multiracial struggle of people who felt like one of them had been killed, not just a random Black guy. They felt like one of them had been killed. You can't have this level of racial consciousness in the U.S. without the struggles of the past. And what that shows is that we have become a people through these struggles. MLK was killed, Malcolm was killed, Fred Hampton was killed, and other great leaders were killed. There was virtually no protest. A lot of these people were hated by the American people. But because of the successes of their struggles, the consciousness, the racial consciousness of a lot of white Americans has changed to the point where today, I mean, it's more likely that young white people are anti-racist than racist. Racism is looked at mockingly. You know, the videos that go viral of people being racist, they do so because it's literally a joke. People think it's so completely ridiculous and irrational that it's funny to see. And that right there, I think destroys the foundation of racism. And if we're more and more a people, then today the people that say, no, Black people have to be their own nation, Indigenous have to be their own nation, they're not American. Those are the people that are serving division at a time when we need more and more unity and have the premises for unity established. And there's one class that benefits from division. There's one class that benefits from disunity, and that's the capitalist class. They're the ones that in this general crisis of legitimacy, where everyone understands that the country is going to shit, where no one trusts any of the dominant institutions, they're the ones that want a left that promotes disunity, that promotes tribalism in organizing instead of bringing people together on the common foundations of what it is that they share, which is the fact that their interest lies in building a new society where it's actually of, by, and for the people, of, by, and for working people, not of, by, and for big corporations, investment firms, and major banks.
Okay, so next we're going to have Laura. Sorry for the surprise attack, Laura. Unmute yourself, followed by Citizen One. So go ahead, Laura.
Okay, I want to thank you for such an obviously thought-provoking presentation. And it's an interesting mix to me. I have a reaction of you're bringing people together and you're dividing people, you know, by what we're doing. It's interesting to me. I don't quite get it. But the one comment I wanted to make is that your reminding me of a couple of books by Rutger Bregman, the young Dutch historian, where he wrote the Utopia for Realists. And it was about the universal basic income, open borders, and a 15-hour work week. He wrote that in 2016 when he was, I think, 20-something. And then he wrote Humankind, A Hopeful History, which was talking about how basically humans are decent, and how if we organized from that position, which is reminding me, what you're saying is reminding me of that, if that we consider that MAGA folks, that whatever, you know, that the people, other Americans are more decent than we think they are, more likely to be aligned with us than we think they are, and more likely to want a better world in sort of the same way. But I wondered what your opinion of, or, you know, familiarity with Rutger Bregman. So that's my question, comment.
Thank you for your question. I haven't heard of them. So I'll definitely look this work up. I'm not necessarily in favor of open borders. I know that's a somewhat popular thing in parts of the US and Western left. I think that there is a genuine argument to be made that the flow of migrant labor into a country, labor that's obviously rooted in the fact that imperialism has decimated these people's countries and there's literally nowhere else to go. It's not something that benefits neither migrant laborers nor laborers at home. Migration, as Emmanuel Ness has argued in his recent book, is a necessary phenomenon for imperialism. The national capitalist class benefits from the super exploitation of these undocumented workers. And I think just like most socialist republics have in the past, a socialist America would have to also have borders. It's just a reality of the world that we live in. And I say that as an immigrant and as someone who is empathetic to the people that have to come here and exist as undocumented immigrants. They should have rights. The people that are already here should have their rights, but I don't think that having a sensible and comprehensive border policy is like against, you know, being a socialist. For the vast majority of history, socialists were the guys that were in favor of having border policies because they knew how it would affect the bargaining power of the national working class. But we should wholeheartedly reject any bigotry against immigrants and realize that the interests of migrant undocumented labor is fully aligned with those of the national citizen working class. As far as bringing together and dividing, one of the goals of the Institute since we started was uniting. It's always been unity. We never understood how organizations that have 99% in common and 1% apart on central issues could be so divided. As an institute, we have reached out to all of the organizations on the left, many of which have worked with us. But we've come to notice with time that it's hard to unite with people whose fundamental political practice is so divisive, who are so rooted in identity politics, cancel culture, and the purity fetish, that they're the sort of people that you bring them in and what they produce is division. And those sorts of people we're not really interested in uniting with, not for the sake of promoting disunity, but for the opposite, because there's a whole lot of modes of existence that you find in the US left that they just promote constant disunity and fracturing and sectarianism, and we're fully against that. And I think there's, you know, forms of political but also personal maturity that underpin a lot of those things. And we keep our arms open if people want to come and work with us and are willing and capable and have the discipline and are not just going to start petty squabbles over small things, we're open to that. And we see our platform, as you mentioned, as one of unity, but it appears as disunity and controversial for a lot of the forces that have been fundamental in sustaining disunity and promoting separation of forces that should be together.
Okay, next is Citizen One. Let's try to keep the question short because we're running late, followed by Noah, then Janet. We're going to try to get everybody in, so please keep your questions. Go ahead, Citizen One. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Citizen One, I don't hear anything. Does anybody else? No,
I don't.
okay.
No,
All
we
right,
don't.
let's go to Noah. We'll come back to you, Citizen One. I'm not sure what happened, but go ahead, Noah.
Yeah, hi everybody. I think a lot of the issues here are that for a very long time, the what we referred to as a left in the U.S. has existed on a few ideas, and one of them is that all of us have it too good, and we should care about those who have it less good. And that takes different forms, right? And I think when we come to a point like we are now, when American workers no longer have it too good, right? When the middle class is dying out, the return of very like orthodox Marxist-Leninist positions can seem disruptive to what's been going on the last years. And so my question for you, Carlos, is one to try to bring people together rather than split us up and divide us. And that is, which utopian socialists in American history, besides the ones you mentioned, like Thoreau, and besides the Marxists like Du Bois, do you think were actually part of movements that helped bring history forward?
Thank you so much, Noah. It's weird getting a question from Noah because he's like my best friend. And
Usually I ask him on the phone.
the phenomenon that he was referring to, I think his work in this area is the best of its kind, and it's yet to be published in book form, but it's about reproletarianization, how the middle class has died, how that stability and security that was afforded to for a very long time, specifically a white part of the working class, is completely gone, and how that leaves us with a new opportunity and more fertile grounds for the struggle for socialism. I would have got into it, but I ran a little long with my presentation, but it was one of my notes to hit. As far as the utopians, I think that all of them in various forms played distinctive roles in advancing the class struggle in their areas, even if they often didn't think about it as a class struggle, because one of the central parts of at least the old utopians was the idea that what you needed was class harmony. In many ways, like it is in that sense a precursor to like a fascist form of utopianism. There is definitely overlaps in terms of the conceptions of class collaboration within certain contexts, but I do think that utopians advanced the class struggle in various areas, but the era of utopians, socialists being able to do that, I think is far gone. Everything is dependent on time and space, and in a time and space, the utopians were good, and in another time and space, such as ours, I don't think utopianism, which is so readily found in parts of the U.S. left, is progressive at all. I think it just moves us away from a sober, realistic, concrete analysis of our situation and how within the basic components of that situation we have the capacity to move forward.
Okay, Citizen One, you want to give it another try? We couldn't hear you before. You're not muted on Zoom, but please give it another try. I think your microphone might be muted mechanically, so go ahead and try and work on that. I'm going to go to Janet and then Raj. Janet, please, one question. Okay, one question. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carlos, for your presentation.
Would you comment on the African People's Socialist Party, which is based on, I might not be getting this completely correct, based on the capitalist system and the wealth in America and the collective West, including the privileges of the white working class, were built on chattel slavery of Africans and the looting of the natural resources of Africa. And that in the US, descendants of slavery are owed reparations, that the African American working class, under the leadership of the APSP, must lead the way to socialism in the US, and that African liberation and African internationalism is the direction to take, not the Pan-Africanism of Du Bois. I'm going to post an article about that in the chat. Also, would you, has the ACP reached out to the APSP, and does the ACP support the Uhuru 3, whose trial is set for September 3rd?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your question. Yeah, we at the Institute, my institute has spoken out quite a few times against the persecution of Amelia Chiteli, the Uhuru 3, and the Comrades Party. I disagree with the framework. We're more rooted in traditional Marxist-Leninist point of view. What they call the colonial mode of production, we just call it capitalism. We argue that colonialism is a stage. Modern colonialism is a stage within the capitalist mode of life as a whole, just like imperialism and neocolonialism are. I disagree with the idea of the skin strategy organizing, so organizing just on the basis of race. I very much take my analysis here from Henry Winston. For those that don't know, he was one of the most brilliant leaders of the Communist Party, a black man himself, someone who was jailed and assaulted and literally blinded in prison because of the intense repression he received. And he was fiercely critical of any sorts of skin strategies that tried to organize people just on the basis of what they are racially, and especially in a post-1964 US, where the American people are more united than ever, where so many of us like just grow up with black brothers and sisters in our communities, and they're just us. I think a strategy that tries to organize just black people or just white people or just this, just that, I don't think it's effective. For our age, I understand how some people within those communities might come to think that, but it's not a strategy I agree with. Yeah.
Can you comment on the Uhuru 3? That was the second part of her question.
Oh, the ACP has we have a party program coming out alongside our convention. From what I've spoken to the other comrades in the executive board and Politburo, everyone sympathizes with the cause of the Uhuru 3, just like we did at the Institute. And we did quite a few videos and republished articles talking about their situation, and any sort of federal government, or as the MAGA people would say, deep state attack on people that are dissenting, even if it's ways of dissenting that we wouldn't agree with. I think it's unconstitutional, it's wrong, and should be condemned.
Have you reached out to the APSP to work with them?
We have not reached out to work with them. I know that a member of our Politburo and the international director of the Midwestern Marx Institute, Danny Shaw, has collaborated with them a few times and has been on their medias various times, recorded sending solidarity message to the Uhuru 3, but we have not reached out. We have different tendencies and different conceptions of what the class struggle today in the US implies. There's a lot of areas of agreement, specifically on foreign policy, but I don't see why we wouldn't be able to reach out and collaborate on the areas of agreement. That's something that we're always in favor of. If we agree on the principal things, we can work together on those, even if we disagree in other areas.
Okay, we're going to run over a little bit. I've gotten permission from our committee to run over our usual time. So, Raj, if you would ask your question, then Richard Wright. So, Raj,
Okay,
please go
thank
ahead.
you, Carlos. Very thought-provoking talk. Now, I want to talk about a little bit about imperialism. That's the question is going to be on that. To prepare for the question, the background. Lenin wrote his famous analysis of capitalism at its highest stage, which he called imperialism. And he was analyzing the economic aspect of it in his booklet, as you know. And I believe Marxists generally have confused military aspect with economic aspect. So oftentimes there's a confusion about what does imperialism represent. It is, according to Lenin, it's a weak stage of capitalism. It's its most weakest stage, and therefore it can be broken at the weakest link, which is in Russia, and came up with a strategy of allying with the petty bourgeoisie, which was peasant largely, and also with oppressed nationalities. So in the United States, it's equivalent, in my opinion, and I would like your comment on that, first of all, on this, is that we are back in the stage of imperialism globally, for capital. So it's a weak stage again. In between 45 to 70, it was not the weak stage. It had reconstituted itself. And after 70, it returned to the imperial stage. And then Chinese investment in China, it again gave it another lease of life for 15 years. By 2005 or 6, it was back again, and this time even bigger. So now there's no way out. So in the United States, for a revolutionary strategy, what is the equivalent of the tripod that Bolsheviks had, which is class leading, working class, proletarians at the head, leading the petty bourgeoisie, which is the peasantry, and the oppressed minority, which in our case would be Black minorities, Latin minorities, and other minorities who are oppressed. And when they got this successfully done, they could make the revolution. So what does the ACP and your view is in the American context? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I share your sentiment that there's no way out for imperialism. I know that in our tradition, we say there's nowhere out quite often, and then somehow capitalism finds a way out. But I really do think this time there's no way out. I think that multipolarity is fundamentally moving us into it's almost a geopolitical revolution. It's a new logic that is animating international relations. It's fundamentally anti-imperialist, and I would even go further that it does move us very much closer to a socialist form of life and the sort of international relations that I think we would see operative in a socialist world. My good friend and what was that? My good friend and colleague Oscar Rojas, political economy professor out of Mexico, he has developed the idea that what multipolarity represents is a transition towards a communal mode of production, primarily because what's emphasized is not capital accumulation, but social and common good, and the development of a real productive economy, not just this parasitic extraction of value and profit on the basis of interest and rents and stock buybacks, which is what the basis of American economic growth is today. It's just fully parasitic. And what you find in this whole new BRICS camp is a logic that that says that nations are kind of functioning as free associated producers that get to trade and engage with each other on the basis of win-win relations, and production itself is going to be real production, real economic growth. I think in the countries where there isn't a dictatorship of the proletariat operative, that's going to make the class struggle in those areas more acute. As far as the U.S. And the class strategy, I think that today we have not only the proletariat that has a productive part of the working class that has been decimated by NAFTA and neoliberalism and the crisis of the 70s, where the capitalist class either financialized or exported productive capital abroad. We have that class. I still think, along with Henry Winston, that they're the front rankers in the ACP. We're still processing applications, but the 300 people we've been able to process so far, 80% are blue collar workers, people who engage in productive work for a living. I think you also have to organize alongside them, but with them at the head as the front rankers. You have to organize the reproletariat sections of the working mass at large that for a period of time in the middle of the last century were kind of bourgeoisified, obtained the stability and comfort and economic security that's foreign to the working class, and that have now been completely reproletarianized. Their lives are plagued usually by debt, by precarity, and it's kind of people like in my class position, like intellectual work. With the degrees that I have, I would have been very stable in the 1960s and 70s and the 50s. But as of right now, I'm just, a body walking around with $100,000 in debt and trying to figure out, like 80% of Americans, how the hell I'm going to pay my bills at the end of the month and make sure that my family survives. So that reproletariat has to be in that coalition. I think small businesses, man, like the old Communist Party program from 35, they had small businesses within the potential allies of the proletariat. They're a vacillating class. We should understand that, but small businesses, I think, are very sharply in contradiction with monopoly capital, finance capital, and have a hell of a lot more in common with us than with the capitalist class. And working class communities are livened when there's thriving small businesses that you can go see whenever you go hang out in your communities with your coworkers. So we should be pro getting small businesses on board. As far as oppressed nationalities, I think that because of the struggle against apartheid, the Black freedom movement, and all of these different struggles, I would just consider that to be just the organizing of the working class. Our working class is already multiracial. And yes, we should be able to address things like reparation that I do think they're due to Black people. But I don't think we're in the same context where Lenin was, where it's very clear that there's like an oppressed nationality within the country that's distinct from just the working class. I do think there continues to be specific forms of oppression that exist. They exist de facto, not de jure anymore. They're not legally sanctioned as they were back in the day. But I think the process of organizing oppressed peoples is already implicit, already within the organization of the working class. And yeah, that I guess would be my answer to that.
Okay, Richard, thank you very much for your patience. Richard Wright, if you would unmute, try and keep your question short. Followed by Polina, Citizen One. I hope you have your mic. If not,
yes, I do.
Okay, we'll get to you after that. Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Okay, I'll keep my questions really short. Actually, I have a couple questions, but I'll just very, very briefly. It seems to me that you've there's been a change in the role of the lumpen proletariat. Does that still exist? How do we address that? And if you could just comment on the lumpen proletariat. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think people assume that the lumpen proletariat is just like precarious workers, people that are not working full time, either people that don't have a job, people that are unemployed. That's not what the lumpen proletariat is. Like Engels and Marx and Lenin, they all called, and you find this in most in all socialist countries, the lumpen proletariat is called the dangerous class. It's like the criminal class. those people whose sheer desperation at the level of their material conditions makes them not only viable, but actively so to sell the interest out of the working class and to participate in crime. This is the class position that scabs were pulled from. This is the class position that betrayed, the great Black Panther party. And it's a class that's not to be trusted. Now, that's as a class. As individuals, right now we have our party that's handing out, for instance, clothes and other necessities to people on Skid Row. More than 100 people got shirts and I believe meals as well, or if not, some form of food from our party in California, in Skid Row. And look, that's I'm sure a lot of the people that we're interacted with in terms of class position are lumpen, but they're also human individuals that have the capacity to change, that were put in those positions because it's where the vast majority of Americans are at. When we see statistics like 60 to 80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, that means that the vast majority of Americans are a couple paychecks away from being in the streets through no fault of their own, just the system. These are not individual moral failings, but systemic, symbols of a systemic crisis that's at hand. So, we have to treat these people with compassion. We have to serve their needs, I think, as well, but always be conscious that as a class, it's a class position that is, in some ways dangerous. In some ways, it produces great discomfort for regular working people as well, who are usually the subjects of crime from this class. The lumpen doesn't go out and commit crimes against rich people because they're not even allowed in those neighborhoods. It's usually poor working class people that are subjected to forms of terror and trauma that come from lumpen elements, and that should be opposed. But again, as individuals, they should be served and treated with dignity and respect, as every human being should.
Okay, Polina, if you would unmute, followed by Citizen One and Richard F. And
All right.
we're going to be wrapping up. So go ahead,
Thank
Polina.
you, Alan. Hi, Carlos. I have a question about the PSL. Just to preface that by saying that I am not a member of the PSL and I have my own critiques of their work, but they are a presence among young people. I am curious, you say that you're advocating for unity. I have heard people adjacent to your institute claim that the PSL are ultimately shilling for the Democratic Party, or that they're Trotskyists somehow. I'm just curious your take on, have you reached out? Do you think that there might be communication between the ACP and the PSL? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. As far as the Trotskyism, their organization, I believe last time I checked online, it says Marxist and Leninist, which is usually how Trotskyites describe themselves. They still describe themselves as Leninist, but there's a difference between Marxist and Leninist and Marxist-Leninist. Marxist-Leninist is usually what's identified as Stalinism by the Trotskyites. They also come from the legacy of the Workers' World Party, which was a Marxiste party and has its foundations in Trotskyism. And I honestly, I couldn't care less if they prefer Trotsky to Stalin. I think they take a whole lot of good positions on foreign policy issues, on issues of imperialism. I think there's areas where they're quite weak in their anti-imperialism. For instance, prominent PSL members and even leaders have condemned Russia's special military operation. I think that Russia's special military operation is not only progressive, but a pivotal nodal point in the transition to a multipolar world, and something that the working class across the world and oppressed communities should be able to see their interest on the side of Russia's SMO. As far as reaching out to them as an institute, we've worked with them in the past, not with them in an official capacity, but we've interviewed some of their candidates and at local offices. We've interviewed some of their scholars and the people that work for Liberation School. But as of 2 years, every time we hit up leading faces in PSL, the reply that we get is, yeah, we're big fans of Midwestern Marx, definitely. We'll come on and do an interview. And then they run it up to the Beckers, which is basically just the Politburo and Secretariat of the party. It's just Beckers. And the Beckers say no, and then we hear crickets afterwards. So very prominent people we wanted to interview, for instance, Claudia de la Cruz. She said yes, that she'd be down for it to head up the campaign, and then crickets. And this is another one of the examples where like we have consistently stretched out the hand, even if there's disagreements. And if there's ever not been a hand shaken, it's because we stretched it out and the other side stopped it. And I think PSL is an archetypical example. We have asked to work with various of them, and it's been rejected. There's also other ideological issues. I think that they're very much rooted in what we've called activist brain, the conception that change is going to come just by throwing people out into protest. I don't think that's how you change minds and hearts. And I think the name of the game today is the war of positions, the battle of ideas. And that's done in a different way. I think that's done through community service, through people talking to their coworkers, through people engaging in their communities. And I don't see the PSL doing a whole lot of that. I see a whole lot of performative activist stuff, a lot of holding signs up every weekend with the same group of people. And all that does is remobilize the same people that already agree with you. And again, the name of the game is winning over the critical mass. The vast majority of Americans that are either apolitical or dissenting in some other form that has to be captured, I think, by communists. So they've also, in some ways, sworn war on us, which, there's a lot of stuff that can't be said publicly, but there's good reason why there isn't collaboration. And I can assure you that we're not the party that's saying no. At least as an institute, we weren't the people saying no to collaborating. So
Okay, Citizen One, hopefully we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, I don't know what happened to my mic, but I ended up relaunching Zoom, and that's
Okay, let's keep it down to about 2 minutes.
Sure thing. I've got my timer on. I just want to say that, yes, sadly, communist Angela Davis supported Obama in his run for the presidency and even said that he was the apotheosis of the Black struggle. So go figure. I see that the Dems are responsible for Trump. The neoliberal Dems were responsible for Trump's presidency. As some people may know, West Virginia whites and Rust Belt whites had voted for Obama twice before they got tired of the neoliberalism, whether they knew the word or not. My question is, I think we should have a discussion on identity politics. Several people in this group know that I, as the only Black person in a discussion group, was kicked out of this nominally Marxist discussion group the very first time race was discussed. And I was kicked out by the majority of whites and Asians in that group. I wish Sheila had been there as being divisive because of my differing opinion on race. So I would like to know what your guest thinks of the issue of race and Marx. I know it's been a big question before, but I find it interesting. And several white people also quit that group based on the way I was treated. But I think it's quite ironic and almost sadly funny that white liberalism raised its ugly head and kicked me out of this discussion group the first time race was discussed, and the only Black member in the group. Thank you.
Can I ask what position that you took that they kicked you out for?
I really don't want to get into. I'm not exactly sure if you could address his specific question about race just briefly, and then because we're getting close to the end, we're past the end. Go ahead.
I didn't do politics. I didn't do politics.
Well, my position is, as I alluded to earlier, I think that in the period of apartheid and in the period of slavery, the struggle against racism was itself a form of class struggle. And I think that today a whole lot of liberals and people rooted in identity politics go back and look at those struggles as through a very race essentialist and race determinist outlook. I think that's incorrect. I think those were class struggles that took the form of the struggle against racism. As far as race itself, I'm a race eliminativist, which is like the position that there isn't, besides some social realities that have been created by capitalism, there isn't anything fundamentally, materially real about race. We're just humans. And I think the progressive position, the people that were at the forefront of the scientific study of race, a lot of them, which were socialists and progressives, that's the conclusion. Race is not a real thing. And I think that identity politics has made a whole large parts of the left somehow race essentialist and race determinist. And I think that's incorrect. I think that, alongside other things, promotes a tribalism that just divides people. And it's kind of very ironic that something so artificial that you can't pinpoint like any real material difference besides just literal pigmentation, it's the archetype of superficial because it's literally superficial. That is taken as such a real thing by parts of the left, and then other realities that are much more material and scientifically confirmable become much more fluid for them, much more unreal, and subject to variations and then spectrums and different things. I think that's kind of ironic, and people like Adolf Reed Jr., Walter Ben Michaels, and many other people, I think, have said really good things in this area. Adolf Reed Jr., his son.
Okay.
I respectfully disagree on your race essentialism.
Okay.
Disagree?
I think we could. I think we
Yes, I
should do
disagree on your race essentialism.
We'll do a separate program, I think, on related to this question. Okay, last one is Richard F. If you would please ask your question.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to the ACP, and I saw that little video, which I thought was fun, published with industrial workers. I fear a little bit that you're sidelining the section of the proletariat that is engaged in what Zhuganov calls the direct reproduction of the working class, which is actually mostly a feminine section. Teachers, medical professionals, mental health professionals, and of course mothers, which would which is I have to hand that to Angela Davis. She pointed out that important thing, although I disagree with her solution, which is a sort of bourgeois solution. But your comments, please.
Yeah, I think that part of the context of the video is also a left that has completely gone to the other extreme in terms of how it thinks about the working class, and then just calls anything working class. I saw someone, a philosophy professor from PSL, recently tweet out that prostitutes are proletarians, which I found very, very ridiculous. Anyone even slightly cognizant of the positions that the classics of Marxism have taken on the question of prostitution would realize how utterly ridiculous that is. But I agree completely with you. As someone whose wife works as a mom, it is work. It's a lot of hard work, and studies have shown that it's even more stressful than most of the regular 9-to-5 jobs. And I think that these sectors of societies and other sectors that are actually treated as jobs, but usually not very valuable, not valued by society, they should obviously be incorporated. But I still hold on to Winston's line that the front rankers are those that are engaged in productive labor, and then they're the front rankers. That doesn't mean that that the other sectors of the working class are dismissed or not organized, but I think that it's those people who should be at the forefront. And you also have certain cultural clashes, which are kind of unfortunate. I have found that most blue collar working class people, in terms of social positions, stuff on sexuality, gender, they're somewhat more conservative and traditional. And I've also found that, on the contrary, in these other positions, some in the service sector, some like teachers and professors and college educated folks engaging in salaried work, they're usually very liberal when it comes to some of those other positions. And there is a sort of cultural clash there. And my experience, at least, I might be wrong, there might be different realities in other parts of the country, but my experience is that the blue collar workers are never the ones that are canceling the other side. They usually have an attitude that's very tolerant. You know, they might not understand certain things, but they tolerate you and respect you as a human being. But it's the other side that I have often found canceling regular working people for things that are just so completely inessential that it's frankly ridiculous. So by putting the blue collar working class productive labor as the front rankers, you prevent those sorts of unnecessary splits, that cancel culture that's so poisonous, because the basis is going to be those blue collar workers.
Okay, we're almost at the end here. I want to thank Carlos for coming today. I apologize to everybody for the technical problems that we had for getting started late. This was a tremendous session. I really appreciate and respect the comments from and the questions from the audience. This was quite stimulating and quite challenging. Obviously, these are important questions.
It's 12:59 p.m.
Okay, we obviously have a lot of important questions that we need to consider for the future. I want to point out that Jackson Hinkle has several million followers on X. If Carlos, I might get actually expelled from the planning committee of the ICSS, but if Carlos can put a word in for us, we actually have about 2,000 people on our mailing list. So I'm not sure it would be a great outreach for him, but if he wants to come here and defend, or somebody from the ACP to come on, I'd like to actually push that forward to the ICSS and to the ACP. So thank you very much. Next week, Radhika Desai. The week after, Roger Harris on Venezuela. Thank you, everybody. Go to our website, icssmarx.org. Thanks very much, everybody. Let's stop the recording.
Okay, very good. I'm going to stop the recording.